There is a particular quality to the sea at night, off the coast of Japan, in the hours after the last lantern on shore has ceased its flickering. When the water becomes something more than water, it becomes a mirror to the sky, black and trembling, and the horizon, that thin line separating the known from the unknowable, dissolves entirely. Fishermen who have worked these waters for generations will tell you in low and measured voices that it is precisely in these moments, when the world loses its edges, that something old stirs beneath the surface. They call it the Umibozu. Say the word slowly and it settles into you like fog settling over a harbor. Umi, the sea. Bozu, a Buddhist monk, a shaved head, a presence defined by its stillness and its gravity. Together, the sea monk, the bald one of the deep, a name that does not shout, but rather arrives quietly, the way all truly ancient things do. For centuries, Japanese sailors have spoken of an entity that rises from the ocean, not with violence, but with an almost terrible patience, a being so vast, so unhurried in its emergence, that the sight of it does not initially register as danger. It registers first as wonder, a dark shape lifting from the water, then another shape, then the full, awful suggestion of a form, rounded at the top, immense at the shoulders, tapering somewhere below the surface into depths that the eye cannot follow and the mind does not wish to. A body that may stretch 40, 60, perhaps 100 feet into the night air. A silhouette blacker than the water it rises from, blacker than the sky behind it. And then, if you are still there, if your legs have not yet carried you to the opposite end of the vessel, you see what passes for its face. No mouth, in most accounts, no ears, no features that might invite familiarity or suggest anything recognizably living. Only eyes, two pale, luminous circles set into that enormous dark head, looking down at you with an expression that is neither cruel nor kind, an expression, rather, of profound, ancient indifference, the gaze of something that was here before ships, before fishermen, before the word for the sea itself. This is the Umibozu, and it has been watching Japanese sailors come and go for as long as Japanese sailors have had stories to tell. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. What makes the Umibozu so enduring, why it has persisted across centuries of storytelling, while countless other creatures of folklore have faded into footnotes, is not merely its size, though its size is extraordinary. It is the particular feeling the creature evokes. Not simple terror, something more refined. The Japanese aesthetic tradition has long held space for a quality called mono-no-aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the gentle ache of encountering something that reminds you of your own smallness. The Umibozu, strange as it may sound, carries something of that feeling with it. Sailors who survived their encounter did not always describe screaming. Many described silence, a long, breathless moment of staring upward at a thing that dwarfed everything they had ever known, and feeling beneath the fear something close to awe. The creature belongs to a class of supernatural beings in Japanese folklore, known as yokai, a vast and wonderfully strange category that encompasses ghosts, demons, shapeshifters, tricksters, and entities so bizarre they resist all Western classification. The yokai tradition is one of the richest imaginative inheritances in human culture, and within it, the Umibozu occupies a rare and specific place. It is a creature of open water, not rivers, not lakes, not the sheltered harbor, the deep ocean, the place where the chart runs out. In the days of wooden sailing vessels and hand-drawn maps, when the ocean between Japan and the wider world was genuinely, completely unknown. That distinction carried enormous weight. The Umibozu did not haunt familiar waters. It lived precisely where familiarity ended. Its appearance varies across regions and centuries, as folklore always does, shaped and reshaped by the hands that pass it along. In some accounts, it is entirely black, the color of an ink brushstroke on dark paper. In others, it shimmers faintly, as though lit from within by some cold, submarine light. Some traditions give it arms, great, sweeping limbs that emerge from the water like the arches of a broken bridge. Others insist it has no arms at all, only that monumental torso and those searching, glowing eyes. A few accounts describe it as cloudy, nebulous, more spirit than body, something you could not touch, even if you were brave enough to try. What almost every account agrees on is this: it is calm, eerily, profoundly calm. It does not chase ships. It does not roar. It simply rises and waits and regards you with those pale, unblinking eyes, as though it has been here since before memory began, and has long since grown patient with the brief, flickering creatures who dare the water in their little wooden boats. It is waiting, the old sailors said, for something. Perhaps it is simply waiting to be believed. In the segments ahead, we will follow the Umibozu through time, from its earliest appearances in written record, through the great ukiyo-e woodblock prints that gave it a face the whole world could see, into the regional legends that shaped it differently on every coastline, and finally into the modern age, where it lives on in ways its original storytellers could never have imagined. There is no need to hurry. The sea goes nowhere, and neither, it seems, does the creature within it. Before a legend can become a legend, it must first be a whisper. And like all whispers, the earliest murmurings of the Umibozu did not arrive in grand literary proclamations or the careful, deliberate strokes of court scholars. They arrived the way most true things do, quietly, at the margins, scrawled in the journals of sailors who were not certain anyone would believe them, passed between fishermen on docks at the edge of morning, in the pause between unloading the catch and heading home to sleep, carried inland by travelers who had heard something from someone who swore it was true. The sea in ancient Japan was not a romantic backdrop. It was a working reality and a genuine danger, and the men and women who lived alongside it understood it with the particular, unsentimental intimacy that comes only from dependency. These were people who needed the ocean to eat, to trade, to survive, and who knew with absolute clarity that the ocean did not need them at all. That knowledge breeds a specific kind of storytelling, not the storytelling of people who observe nature from a comfortable distance, but the storytelling of people who are embedded within it, subject to its moods, alert to its signals, and deeply aware of how much of it remains beyond their understanding. It is from this world, the world of wooden hulls and rope and tidal calendars, that the Umibozu first surfaced. The earliest written references that scholars believe connect to the Umibozu tradition date to the Heian period, roughly the 8th through the 12th centuries, an era of remarkable cultural sophistication in Japan when the imperial court at Kyoto was producing poetry, literature, and art of extraordinary refinement, even as the coastlines remained wild and the fishing communities that populated them lived largely outside the orbit of courtly elegance. It was a time of contrasts, as most meaningful eras are. Silk robes and candlelight in the capital, salt air and dark water at the edges. In the Nihon Ryoiki, one of Japan's oldest collections of Buddhist tales, compiled in the early 9th century by the monk Kyokai, we begin to find stories of supernatural ocean phenomena, entities and events that defy the natural order of the sea, interpreted through the lens of Buddhist cosmology. The sea, in Buddhist tradition, is a place of both literal and metaphorical depth, a realm where karmic forces move in ways invisible to ordinary perception. Strange things rising from deep water were not simply frightening. They were meaningful. They were, in some sense, messages. The earliest ancestors of the Umibozu legend may have lived in this interpretive space, not mere monsters to be fled from, but presences to be understood, or at least respectfully acknowledged. Later, in the Muromachi period, spanning roughly the 14th through the 16th centuries, Japan's yokai tradition began to take on more defined and codified forms. This was the age of the otogi zoshi, short narrative tales that blended courtly romance, Buddhist morality, and supernatural encounter into a literature that reached well beyond the aristocracy. It was also the age of the Hyaku Monogatari, Kaidankai, the gathering of 100 ghost stories, a social tradition in which participants would light 100 candles and take turns telling supernatural tales, extinguishing one candle after each story, so that the room grew progressively darker as the night and the tales deepened. In this atmosphere, candlelight receding, darkness advancing, the boundaries between the mundane and the supernatural, deliberately, ritually eroded, the Umibozu found an eager audience. By this period, the figure of the sea spirit had enough cultural weight that it appeared not as a novelty, but as a known quantity. Writers did not feel compelled to explain what the Umibozu was. They assumed their readers already knew. That assumption, that casual, unstated familiarity, is itself a form of evidence. It tells us that by the medieval period, the Umibozu had already been circulating in Japanese storytelling long enough to become common knowledge. It was old enough by then to be taken for granted. It is worth pausing here to consider the relationship between the Umibozu and the Buddhist tradition more carefully, because it is a relationship that shapes the creature in ways that are easy to overlook. The word bozu, from which the creature takes the second half of its name, is an everyday Japanese word for a Buddhist monk. Specifically, one who has shaved his head, as monks in the Zen and other Buddhist orders traditionally do. The association is not accidental, and it is not merely descriptive. In the popular imagination of medieval Japan, Buddhist monks occupied a complex social and spiritual position. They were figures of learning and authority, yes, but they were also, in folk perception, figures of uncanny power. Monks who had spent years in mountain temples or on remote pilgrimage routes were thought to accumulate a kind of spiritual energy that set them apart from ordinary people. Some of that energy was benevolent. Some of it was, depending on the monk and the circumstance, something else entirely. To look up at the Umibozu, at that vast, rounded, featureless head rising from the ocean, and see in its silhouette the shaved skull of a monk was to layer the fear of the sea with something even more complex. It was not simply a monster. It was a monk-shaped thing, something that had taken on the form, or perhaps the spiritual weight, of renunciation and otherworldly devotion, translated into oceanic scale. A creature that suggested, without ever stating it, that whatever power a monk might accumulate through decades of prayer and discipline, the sea had accumulated something equivalent or greater through sheer age and depth. There is something almost philosophical in that image, and it is precisely this quality, this capacity to carry meaning beyond simple fright, that distinguishes the Umibozu from a common sea monster. It was never just a thing that ate ships. It was a presence that made you think, in the moment of encountering it, about the nature of the world and your place within it. Regional variation is one of the most revealing features of any folk tradition, and the Umibozu is wonderfully, instructively varied across the different coastal communities of Japan. Along the coastlines of the Kii Peninsula, the great forested promontory that juts southward into the Pacific, a landscape of ancient shrines and deep-rooted spiritual tradition, stories of the Umibozu tend to emphasize its stillness. It rises, it watches, it does not interact unless provoked. Local fishermen developed a practice, described in several regional accounts, of maintaining absolute silence when the creature appeared, neither speaking to it nor calling out to companions on other vessels. To break the silence, some believed, was to invite catastrophe. The Umibozu of the Key Coast was a presence that demanded, above all, respect and quiet. It was not a predator. It was something closer to a test. In the waters around the island of Shikoku, whose own coastline is inseparable from the Buddhist pilgrimage tradition of the 88 temples, accounts of the Umibozu carry a distinctly more ambivalent character. Here, the creature appears in stories not always as a threat, but sometimes as a witness. Pilgrims who crossed by sea to continue their journey along the coast reported seeing dark shapes at the water's surface, shapes that seemed to observe the passage of the boat without menace. Whether this reflects a genuine regional difference in the legend, or simply the perceptual difference between a frightened fisherman and a spiritually prepared pilgrim, is impossible to say. But it is a meaningful distinction. The same darkness on the water could mean entirely different things depending on who was watching. Further north, along the Japan seacoast, a rougher, less romantic stretch of water than the Pacific side, prone to sudden storms and treacherous seasonal swells, the Umibozu traditions carry a sharper edge. Here, the creature is more frequently described as an active disruption, something that approaches ships with purpose, that generates great waves in otherwise calm water, that has been known, in the most dramatic accounts, to request objects from sailors. One persistent motif in this region involves the creature surfacing alongside a vessel, and, in a voice like the sound of the ocean floor shifting, demanding a barrel or a cask. Sailors who complied, handing over whatever they had, were left unharmed. Those who hesitated, or who handed over a cask with the bottom intact, found it returned to them filled with seawater and sinking their vessel with the weight. The lesson embedded in that particular story is not subtle, but it is worth dwelling on. The correct response to an encounter with the Umibozu was not resistance, and not clever defiance. It was a kind of gracious, unhesitating surrender. Give what is asked, make no fuss. Acknowledge, in the most practical terms possible, that you are a small thing in a large world, and that the large world occasionally requires tribute. That is not a monster's lesson. That is the sea's lesson. Personified, given eyes, given scale, given that great rounded head tilting down toward you in the dark. But the sea's lesson nonetheless. And perhaps that is the oldest thing about the Umibozu. Not its size, not its silence, not its monastic silhouette against the stars. Perhaps the oldest thing about it is what it has always been quietly trying to tell us. That the ocean was here before we arrived, and will remain long after we have gone, and that the most sensible response to that fact is not fear, but a certain humble, grateful, wide-eyed wonder. The kind of wonder that keeps you very, very still on the deck of a small boat in the middle of a very large sea, watching something enormous rise toward the surface of the world. There is a particular moment in the life of any legend when it stops being something you hear and becomes something you see. For the Umibozu, that moment arrived with ink and woodblock, and the quiet, deliberate genius of the Edo period, an era that ran from the early 17th century to the latter half of the 19th, and that produced, among its many remarkable gifts to human culture, one of the most distinctive visual languages the world has ever known. The art of ukiyo-e, the pictures of the floating world, began as a celebration of urban pleasure and earthly beauty. The kabuki actor caught mid-gesture, the courtesan in her finest robes, the cherry blossoms falling over the bridge at Yoshiwara. But art, like water, finds its own level, and the artists of the Edo period were too curious, too restless, too alive to the full texture of human experience to remain forever in the pleasure districts. They moved inevitably toward the strange, toward the dark, toward the vast and the old and the deeply unsettling corners of the Japanese imagination, where creatures like the Umibozu had been waiting, patient as the sea itself, for someone skilled enough to draw them, to understand what the ukiyo-e artists accomplished with the Umibozu. It helps to understand what the woodblock print medium could do that no other form of storytelling quite could. A spoken story unfolds in time. You hear one detail, then another, and the creature assembles itself slowly in your mind, its size arriving after its shape, its eyes arriving after its size. The full weight of the encounter building across the length of the telling. This has its own power. But a woodblock print delivers everything at once. You look, and in a single instant you must absorb the creature entire, its relationship to the ship, the sailors, the sky, the water, the horizon. The scale is communicated not through words, but through visual proportion. The terror is not described, it is demonstrated. The great masters of Edo period art understood this completely, and they used it with tremendous sophistication. When they turned their attention to the Umibozu, they were not merely illustrating stories that already existed. They were making permanent, definitive, visually authoritative statements about what this creature was, statements that would fix its appearance in the cultural imagination with a clarity that centuries of oral storytelling had never quite achieved. The name that stands foremost in any discussion of yokai imagery is Toriyama Sekian, an 18th century artist and scholar whose 4-volume compendium of supernatural beings, produced between 1776 and 1784, amounts to one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of illustrative folklore. Sekian was not simply an artist documenting existing beliefs. He was, in a very real sense, a taxonomist of the impossible, a man who brought the same rigorous attention to the Umibozu and its fellow yokai that a naturalist might bring to the cataloguing of rare birds or deep-sea fish. His rendering of the Umibozu is instructive in everything it chooses to include and everything it deliberately withholds. The creature rises from water, depicted with elegant, almost abstract simplicity. The ocean reduced to a few sweeping lines, the darkness of the figure achieved through dense, confident inkwork that absorbs light the way deep water absorbs everything. The head is immense and featureless, exactly as the oral tradition demanded, rounded in a way that is simultaneously inhuman and strangely serene. There is no mouth rendered in fury, no claws extended in aggression. The Umibozu in Sekian's hand is a thing of composed, almost meditative enormity, more like a presence that has settled into the world than a monster that has erupted into it. Below the creature, the suggested scale of a vessel, small, fragile, entirely at the mercy of the water it floats upon. The contrast is not melodramatic. It doesn't need to be. The proportions speak for themselves. What Sekian gave the world with this and his surrounding work was something the oral tradition, for all its richness, could never provide: consensus. After his compendium circulated, artists, storytellers, and readers across Japan had a shared visual reference for what the Umibozu looked like. The creature that had existed in slightly different forms in the mind of every person who had ever heard its name now had, for the first time, a face, or rather, the deliberate, meaningful absence of one. Sekian's influence flowed forward into the work of the artist who, more than any other figure in Japanese history, brought the power and terror of the natural world into the homes of ordinary people with breathtaking, democratic force. Katsushika Hokusai needs little introduction, even to audiences entirely unfamiliar with Japanese art history, because his most famous work, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, that extraordinary image of a towering, claw-tipped wave dwarfing 3 fishing boats and the distant silhouette of Mount Fuji, has become one of the most reproduced images in human history. But Hokusai's relationship with the sea and with the supernatural ran far deeper than that single iconic print. Throughout his long and astonishingly prolific career, he worked well into his 80s and is said to have lamented on his deathbed that if he had lived only a few years longer, he might have truly learned to draw. Hokusai returned again and again to the meeting place of human fragility and oceanic immensity. His series 100 Ghost Stories, produced late in his career, brought the full weight of his technical genius to bear on the supernatural tradition, and the creatures that emerge from those prints carry a quality that distinguishes them from almost all other yokai imagery of the period. They look real. Not real in the way of documentary illustration. Hokusai was not attempting naturalism in any conventional sense. They look real in the way of things encountered at the edge of consciousness, in the half-second between sleeping and waking, when the mind has not yet fully reinstated its comfortable assumptions about what the world contains. His supernatural figures have weight. They have atmosphere. They exist not against a blank page, but within a rendered environment that makes their presence feel genuinely possible. When Hokusai engaged with sea spirit imagery, the dark, rising forms, the vast shapes that exceeded the capacity of ordinary description, he brought to that tradition a compositional intelligence that amplified the Umibozu's essential qualities rather than simply depicting them. The darkness was not just dark. It had texture. It had depth. The water was not just water. It was a surface between worlds, and something beneath it was about to break through. Beyond the great individual masters, the visual tradition of the Umibozu spread through the Edo period in forms far more accessible than collectors' prints and bound compendiums. It appeared in kiboshi, illustrated comic books, yellow-covered, cheap, and widely read, where yokai of all kinds cavorted in stories that were simultaneously funny, frightening, and socially satirical. It appeared on Nishiki-e, multicolored prints sold at festivals and markets to audiences who might spend the equivalent of a few coins on an image of something that would frighten and delight them in equal measure. It appeared on the curtains of kabuki theaters, on the decorated boards of toy shops, in the margins of almanacs. The Umibozu, in other words, was not an elite cultural possession. It belonged to everyone. Fishermen's children in coastal villages and merchants' apprentices in the cities of Osaka and Edo alike could look at its image and feel the same ancient, pleasurable shiver. The shiver of the known darkness, the familiar fear, the monster that has been given a name and therefore, paradoxically made slightly less terrifying and slightly more beloved. This is one of folklore's most reliable mechanisms. The named thing is always more manageable than the unnamed thing. You can draw the Umibozu. You can hang it on a wall. You can teach your children what it looks like and tell them what to do if they ever encounter it. In doing so, you do not banish the fear of the deep ocean. You domesticate it just enough that you can continue living next to it, which is precisely what coastal communities must do, generation after generation, forever. There is one further dimension of the Umibozu's visual tradition that deserves careful attention, and it is perhaps the most subtle. In the most accomplished renderings of the creature, by Sekien, by Hokusai, and by the many gifted artists who followed in their wake, the Umibozu is almost never depicted in the act of destruction. It is not overturning ships. It is not crushing sailors in enormous hands. It is almost invariably simply present, rising, watching, existing at a scale that makes human activity look provisional and small. This compositional choice is not timidity on the part of the artists. They were entirely capable of depicting violence. The ukiyo-e tradition contains some of the most dramatic battle imagery in the history of art. The choice to show the Umibozu in stillness was deliberate, and it reflects something true about the creature's deepest nature. The horror of the Umibozu was never what it might do. It was what it was. Its mere existence, its scale, its patient and incurious gaze was the event. You did not need to show it destroying anything. The human figures at the bottom of the composition were already destroyed, in the way that matters most, stripped of the comfortable assumption that the world was built to human proportions and operated according to human logic. The artists understood this, and in understanding it, they gave the Umibozu the only treatment it truly deserved. They showed it whole and real and enormous and quiet, and they let the silence do the rest. There is a truth about folklore that academic study sometimes obscures in its effort to find the universal pattern, the common thread, the single origin point from which all variations descend. The truth is this: stories belong to places, not to cultures in the abstract, not to nations as political entities, not to languages as systems of grammar and vocabulary, but to specific, particular, irreplaceable places, to the smell of a certain harbor at low tide, to the sound a specific stretch of water makes when the wind comes from the northeast in November, to the particular shade of grey that the sky turns over one bay and not another in the hour before a storm arrives. Folklore is not portable in the way that furniture is portable. You can carry it from one place to another, and it will survive the journey, but something in it will have shifted. Some essential molecule of meaning will have rearranged itself to accommodate the new geography. The Umibozu, more than almost any other creature in the Japanese supernatural tradition, demonstrates this truth with extraordinary clarity. Follow it along the coastline of Japan, that long, intricate, island-complicated coastline, one of the most varied in the world, and you will not find one creature. You will find many, the same name, the same fundamental silhouette, but different souls, shaped by different waters, carrying different lessons for the people who lived beside them. Begin in the north, in the cold, iron-grey waters of Tohoku, the northeastern region of Japan's main island of Honshu, a landscape of deep forests, volcanic mountains, and a Pacific coastline that has always been simultaneously generous and brutal. This is a coast that has provided extraordinary harvests of fish and seafood to the communities along it for thousands of years, and that has also, in its periodic moments of geological fury, reminded those same communities of its absolute indifference to their survival. The Umibozu of Tohoku carries the character of its environment. It is, by regional consensus, larger here than elsewhere, not merely enormous in the way of something that exceeds ordinary scale, but vast in a way that seems almost geological, as though the creature shares its substance with the ocean floor itself. Local accounts, collected by folklorists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries before many of these oral traditions began to fade, describe encounters in which the creature's emergence changed the behavior of the water across a wide radius. Currents shifted. The surface tension of the sea seemed to alter. Fishing boats reported feeling a pull, not dramatic, not violent, but persistent and deliberate, as though the water itself were being reorganized around some immense gravitational presence below. Fishermen of this coast developed, over generations, a set of practical protocols for Umibozu encounters that are remarkable for their specificity and their pragmatism. Do not make noise, do not point, do not look directly at the eyes for more than a moment. Sustained eye contact was considered a form of challenge, or perhaps an invitation, neither of which was desirable. If the creature approached the vessel, the correct response was to sit down, lower your center of gravity and wait. Not to pray, exactly, though prayer was not discouraged. Simply to wait, with as much interior stillness as you could manage, until the presence withdrew. There is something almost meditative in that prescription. Sit down, be still, wait. It is not the protocol of people who believe they can fight or flee. It is the protocol of people who have made a careful and realistic assessment of their situation and have concluded that the most effective available response is a quality of conscious, deliberate acceptance. Move south along the Pacific coast, past the Great Bay of Sendai, past the dramatic headlands of the Boso Peninsula, and eventually you reach the waters around the Izu Islands, a chain of volcanic outcroppings extending southward from Tokyo Bay into the open Pacific. where the current that sweeps up from the tropics meets the colder waters of the north and creates an oceanic environment of unusual complexity and beauty. Here, the Umibozu tradition takes a turn that surprises newcomers to the subject. In several Izu Island communities, the creature is not exclusively an object of fear. It is, in certain contexts, something closer to a guardian. This seems paradoxical. The enormous, dark, glowing-eyed spirit of the open ocean as protector rather than threat. But the logic becomes clear when you understand the specific dangers that Izu fishermen faced. The open Pacific around these islands was, and remains, a place of sudden, unpredictable weather shifts. Storms could materialize from clear skies with almost no warning. The current patterns around the islands created whirlpools and unpredictable swells that caught experienced sailors off guard with disturbing regularity. In this environment, the greatest danger was not always the obvious one. Sometimes the greatest danger was the one you didn't see coming. And so the Umibozu, in some local traditions, became associated with a different kind of warning. Its appearance on the water, that rising darkness, those pale eyes catching what little light existed, was interpreted not only as a threat in itself, but as a signal. The creature surfaced before storms, several accounts insist. It rose from the water precisely because the water was about to become more dangerous than the creature itself. Fishermen who saw it and turned immediately for shore sometimes found, arriving safely at the harbor, that the storm that followed was severe enough to have killed them had they stayed out. Whether this represents a genuine folk meteorology, an observed correlation between deep water disturbances and approaching weather systems translated into supernatural terms, or simply the human mind's tendency to find pattern and meaning in coincidence, is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is the function the belief served. It turned an encounter with something terrifying into an encounter with something useful. It gave the Umibozu a role in the community's survival, rather than simply in its nightmares. The western coast of Japan, the shore that faces the Japan Sea rather than the Pacific, presents perhaps the most dramatically different regional Umibozu tradition of all. The Japan Sea is, in meteorological terms, a difficult body of water. Winter storms here are legendary in their severity, generated by cold air masses descending from the Asian continent and picking up moisture as they cross the relatively warm sea surface. The communities along this coast, in the prefectures of Niigata, Ishikawa, Toyama, and their neighbors, built their lives around a body of water that was, for several months of every year, genuinely hostile to human navigation. The fishing seasons were structured around this hostility. The architecture of the coastal villages reflected it, and the folklore, inevitably, was shaped by it. On the Japan seacoast, the Umibozu is considerably more interactive than elsewhere. It speaks in several regional accounts, or rather, it communicates in a voice that witnesses struggled to describe in ordinary terms. Not a human voice, not an animal sound, something below both, emanating from a register that seemed felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. And what it communicates in these accounts is a demand. The barrel tradition, well documented across multiple Japan Sea coastal communities, holds that the creature would approach a vessel and request a container. Fishermen who had heard the old stories knew to offer a barrel with no bottom, a cask that looked intact from the outside but would not hold water. The logic, described in various accounts with a matter-of-fact practicality that is itself remarkable, was this: if you gave the Umibozu a sealed barrel, it would fill it with seawater and use that weight to drag your boat beneath the surface. A bottomless barrel, however, could not be filled. The water would pour straight through. The creature, apparently, would accept the offering without examining it too carefully and depart. What endures in this story, beyond its practical maritime drama, is its underlying wisdom. The Umibozu does not ask for what you cannot give. It asks for something ordinary, a barrel, a cask, a container. The danger lies not in the request itself, but in how you respond to it. Give without thinking, and the gift becomes your undoing. Give cleverly. Give in a way that honors the form of the request while preserving your own survival. And you pass through the encounter intact. It is, in its quiet way, a lesson about negotiating with forces that exceed you. Not defiance, which invites destruction. Not blind compliance, which courts a different kind of destruction, but a third way, thoughtful, careful, respectful of the power you're dealing with, while still, gently and without drama, looking out for yourself. What emerges from this long, patient survey of the Japanese coastline, north to south, Pacific to Japan Sea, volcanic island to ancient fishing village, is not a single creature but a family of creatures, bound by name and silhouette, but diversified by the particular wisdoms and particular fears of the communities that kept them alive in memory. And yet, beneath all the variation, something constant persists. Something that every version of the Umibozu, in every coastal community that ever told its story, carries within it. The sea is older than you. The sea is larger than you. The sea does not organize itself around your needs or your calendar or your understanding of how things ought to work. And the most important knowledge a person who lives beside it can possess is not the knowledge of how to conquer it, because that knowledge does not exist, but the knowledge of how to live alongside it with appropriate humility. The Umibozu, in all its regional variations, in all its forms and behaviors and contradictions, is simply that knowledge given a shape, given eyes that look down at you from an impossible height, given the patience of deep water, and given, in the end, the good grace to let you go, provided you remember what you are and what it is, and conduct yourself accordingly. There is a particular kind of survival that belongs only to the most resilient of things, not the survival of the museum piece, preserved behind glass, carefully labeled, admired at a respectful distance by people who understand, instinctively, that what they are looking at belongs to a finished world, not the survival of the academic footnote, alive only in the specialized literature, tended by scholars whose devotion is genuine, but whose audience is small. The survival we are speaking of is something altogether different, something more restless, more promiscuous, more alive. It is the survival of an idea that keeps finding new containers, that moves from spoken word to written text, to woodblock print, to illustrated book, to cinema screen, to digital canvas, without ever quite losing the essential quality that made it compelling in the first place. The Umibozu has accomplished this, against odds that would seem, on the surface, quite unfavorable. The modernization of Japan, the electrification of its coastlines, the replacement of wooden fishing vessels with steel-hulled trawlers equipped with sonar and satellite navigation, the general and thoroughgoing disenchantment of the natural world that industrial modernity brings with it wherever it goes, this creature of dark water and patient enormity has not only survived the transition into the contemporary age, it has, in certain measurable ways, thrived. The question of how deserves careful, unhurried attention. Begin with the medium that, more than any other, served as the bridge between Japan's folkloric past and its cultural present. Manga, the Japanese tradition of illustrated sequential storytelling, which developed its modern form through the middle decades of the 20th century and expanded into one of the most globally influential narrative art forms in human history, was, from its earliest serious literary ambitions, deeply interested in the supernatural. This was not accidental. The artists who shaped manga's vocabulary in its foundational decades were themselves products of a culture in which yokai, ghosts, and supernatural beings were not archaic curiosities, but living presences in the popular imagination. They had grown up with these stories. They understood, in their bones, the particular emotional register that the supernatural could access. The combination of wonder, dread, melancholy, and dark comedy that had characterized Japanese supernatural storytelling since the Heian period. The figure who stands most prominently at the intersection of manga and yokai tradition is Shigeru Mizuki, whose long-running series, Gegehe no Kitaro, which began its life as a rental manga in the late 1950s and eventually became one of the most beloved franchises in Japanese popular culture, brought the full cast of traditional yokai into the modern world with a warmth, specificity, and genuine folkloric fidelity that distinguished his work from mere monster entertainment. Mizuki had lived through the Second World War, had lost his left arm in combat in the Pacific, and had returned to Japan carrying within him a relationship with death and with the supernatural that was neither casual nor metaphorical. He believed, in some deep and not entirely ironic sense, in the reality of the beings he drew, and that belief communicated itself through every page. The Umibozu appears in Mizuki's work, as it appears in traditional accounts, vast, dark, and fundamentally aligned with the deep logic of the natural world, rather than with any simple agenda of malice. In Mizuki's hands, the creature retained its essential dignity. It was not domesticated into a comic prop or inflated into a mindless villain. It remained what it had always been, a presence that reminded the human characters, and through them the reader, that the world extended far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human concern. Mizuki's influence on subsequent generations of manga artists cannot be overstated. He effectively established the template for how traditional yokai could be handled in modern sequential art, with respect for their folkloric roots, with attention to their regional and historical contexts, and with a willingness to allow them their full emotional complexity, rather than reducing them to a single narrative function. Artists who came after him, working in genres ranging from horror to comedy to literary fiction, inherited this template even when they departed from it, and the Umibozu benefited enormously from the cultural seriousness his work attached to the yokai tradition as a whole. The transition from page to screen brought its own transformations, its own opportunities and challenges. Japanese anime, discovered early that the yokai tradition was not merely a source of monsters for action sequences. It was a complete imaginative universe, with its own internal logic, its own emotional landscape, its own capacity to carry stories of real psychological and philosophical weight. The films and series that engaged most seriously with this tradition were not content to use supernatural beings as obstacles for heroes to overcome. They were interested in what these beings meant, in what they said about the relationship between the human world and the natural world, between the modern and the ancient, between the things we have named and the things that remain, stubbornly, beyond naming. The work of director Hayao Miyazaki, whose films have reached audiences of hundreds of millions across the world, is perhaps the most globally visible expression of this sensibility. While Miyazaki has not placed the Umibozu at the center of a film, his entire body of work breathes the same atmospheric logic that produced the Umibozu legend. The enormous, ancient forest spirit in Princess Mononoke, the enigmatic, radish-shaped, supernatural beings in Spirited Away that drift silently through the bathhouse with a quality that is neither threatening nor friendly, but simply, enormously, other. The sea dragon that Chihiro's friend Haku becomes, vast and sinuous, moving through air the way the Umibozu moves through water, occupying a scale of being that dwarfs ordinary human life without dismissing it. These are not the Umibozu, but they are creatures that could only exist in a culture that had spent centuries telling itself stories about the Umibozu and creatures like it. They carry its DNA. They inherit its emotional register. That precise combination of wonder and humility, that invitation to set aside the comfortable assumption of human centrality and look, for a moment, at the world from an altitude that makes human concerns look very small and very beautiful and very temporary. When Spirited Away won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2003, it brought this entire tradition, a tradition with the Umibozu somewhere in its deep roots, to the attention of a global audience that had no prior framework for it. Many viewers, encountering Miyazaki's supernatural world for the first time, described a feeling they struggled to articulate. Something about the spirits in the film felt different from Western supernatural beings, less adversarial, less oriented toward the human drama at the center, more self-contained, more ancient, more real, in some paradoxical sense, than monsters whose entire existence is organized around being defeated by the protagonist. What those viewers were feeling, without the vocabulary to name it, was the Umibozu tradition, the long Japanese practice of imagining the non-human world as something vast and self-sufficient and genuinely indifferent to human narrative, rather than as a backdrop constructed for human benefit. In the decades that followed, the Umibozu found its way into the full range of contemporary Japanese media with a consistency that speaks to the creature's remarkable adaptability. In the Naruto franchise, one of the best-selling manga series in history, water-based supernatural entities with clear Umibozu lineage appear as some of the most visually and emotionally striking presences in the story. In Pokemon, whose entire conceptual architecture rests on the domestication and companionship of powerful supernatural beings drawn from global folkloric traditions, watertight creatures of enormous size and mysterious depth carry unmistakable echoes of the sea spirit tradition. In Japanese horror cinema, particularly in the remarkable flowering of that genre that occurred in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the visual grammar of the Umibozu, that rising darkness, those pale eyes, that quality of vast and patient approach, was translated into some of the most genuinely unsettling imagery in modern film. But perhaps the most unexpected and, in some ways, most moving chapter of the Umibozu's modern life has been its embrace by digital art communities, both within Japan and, increasingly, around the world. Online platforms devoted to illustrated art have become, over the past 2 decades, remarkable repositories of Umibozu imagery, created by artists of every background and nationality. Artists in Brazil, in Poland, in South Korea, in Nigeria, in the United States have encountered the creature through manga, through anime, through the growing global interest in Japanese folklore that the internet has both enabled and accelerated, and have been moved to render it in their own visual languages, from their own cultural perspectives, using their own aesthetic tools. The results are extraordinary in their variety. Umibozu images rendered in the style of Western oil painting. Umibozu images created with 3-dimensional modeling software that give the creature a physical presence and environmental context that traditional woodblock printing could only suggest. Umibozu images that place the creature in modern settings, rising from the water beside a container ship, or observed through the porthole of a submarine, or reflected in the glass facade of a coastal skyscraper, with a compositional wit that honors both the creature's antiquity and its startling contemporaneity. What this global artistic conversation reveals is something genuinely remarkable. The Umibozu, born from the specific anxieties and spiritual frameworks of medieval Japanese fishing communities, has become a universal image, not because its origins have been forgotten nor its specificity diluted, but because the feeling it embodies, that feeling of looking up at something enormously, incomprehensibly larger than yourself, and finding in that confrontation not only fear but wonder, not only smallness, but a strange, unexpected tenderness toward your own fragile human life, turns out to be a feeling that requires no translation. Every culture has its dark water. Every culture has its moment of standing at the edge of something vast and feeling the ordinary world reorganize itself around the encounter. The Umibozu simply gave that moment a name and a shape, and 2 pale eyes looking down, and the world, it turns out, recognized both immediately. There is a moment, known to anyone who has ever stood at the true edge of the ocean, not a beach resort, not a harbor walkway, but the genuine, unmediated edge, where the land simply ends and the water begins and extends without interruption to the horizon and beyond. When the thinking mind goes quiet, not silent, not empty, quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when something important is about to be said, a waiting kind of quiet. A quality of attention that the ordinary business of living rarely asks of us, and that the ocean, without effort, without intention, produces in almost everyone who stands before it long enough to stop performing and simply be there. The Japanese have always understood this moment. They have built shrines at the water's edge to honor it. They have written poems about it across 15 centuries of literary tradition. They have, in their folklore, populated the darkness beyond the horizon with beings that embody it. Creatures whose primary function is not to threaten or to destroy, but to deepen, to make the experience of standing before the sea into something larger than a single human being, having a single human feeling on a single afternoon. The Umibozu is, in the end, that deepening, given form, given scale, given those quiet, luminous eyes, what the creature has always asked of the people who encounter it, in legend, in woodblock print, in the oral traditions of 100 coastal communities, in the manga panels and animation frames of the modern age, is not courage in the conventional sense. It has never been a thing to be fought. It has never offered the satisfaction of conquest, or the narrative tidiness of defeat. What it is asked, in every version of itself across every century of its existence, is something considerably more difficult than courage. It is asked for honesty, the honesty of recognizing, without flinching, and without the comfortable distancing mechanisms that modern life provides in such abundance, that the world is incomprehensibly large, and that you are, measured against it, very small. Not worthless, not insignificant in the way that nihilism means insignificant, small in the way that a single fish is small within the ocean it inhabits, dependent upon it, shaped by it, part of it, and entirely unable to contain it. This is not a comfortable recognition. The entire project of modern civilization might be understood, at least in part, as an extended effort to avoid it. To build walls high enough, cities bright enough, technologies powerful enough, that the darkness at the edge of the known world recedes to a manageable distance and the creatures within it can be safely forgotten. The Umibozu has watched these efforts with its characteristic patience and its characteristic silence. It has not been impressed. It has not been deterred. It has simply continued to exist in the deep water beyond the last light, waiting with the particular equanimity of something that has outlasted every previous civilization's certainty about the completeness of its own understanding. There is a practice in certain Buddhist traditions of sitting with what cannot be resolved, not solving it, not explaining it, not transforming it into something more comfortable, simply sitting with it, breathing with it, allowing it to be exactly as large and as unresolved as it actually is, and discovering, gradually, quietly, without fanfare, that this is something you can do, that the human capacity for presence is larger than the human capacity for understanding, and that this is not a deficit, but a kind of grace. The Umibozu, that great sea monk, that bold and patient spirit of the Japanese deep, has always known this, has embodied it, perhaps, more completely than any words could. It rises not to instruct, but to demonstrate. It appears not to terrify, but to remind. And what it reminds us of, beneath the fear and the wonder and the ancient shiver of encounter, is simply this: the world is not finished. The map still has edges, and at those edges, in the dark water beyond the last known thing, something vast and old and perfectly serenely alive is watching the light on the surface with the same calm attention it has always given to the brief, bright, beautiful passage of human life across the face of the deep. We came to the water, we told its story, we gave it eyes so we could feel, for just a moment, what it might be like to be seen by something that has been here since before memory began. And perhaps, in telling that story across so many centuries and so many forms, we were not describing a monster at all. Perhaps we were practicing the art of smallness, practicing the art of awe, practicing quietly and together the oldest and most necessary human skill of all. The ability to look up at something we cannot comprehend and remain, nevertheless, exactly where we are. Still, open, present, on the water, in the dark, and unafraid.